Hi, my name is Nathalie Franks, and I've been studying with MSIA for a period of about 50 years. I met JR in 1972 for the first time, and before I met him, I had a series of events that led me to meeting him. One of the first things that I recall in that journey was when I was about 13, I went out on this hill and I started to, what I call, talk to God. And I said to God, I was pretty depressed with the world and what was going on. And I said, if this is all there is, I don't want to be here. And I didn't hear anything back, so I carried on with my life. And then when I was about 15, I started to study different philosophies, different ways of life. I was brought up in the Jewish tradition. And for me, when I sat in the synagogue, I felt this sort of calm come over me, and I thought, this is where it's at. But as I studied more, I saw how the religion itself segregated itself from other nationalities, personalities. So I started to study things like Buddhism, Socrates, different ways of being, different ways of living. And when I was about 18, I went to this spiritualist church, and we were all sitting around in a circle. And there was this woman who was supposed to be the head, the medium. And she said, okay, close your eyes. We're going to have an experience now. So I closed my eyes and I didn't know what to expect. And I literally had this vision. And it was a one-off. I've never had that kind of experience again. I've had visions in my dreams, but not consciously like this one. And when I closed my eyes, I was sort of lifted out. And I went to this scene where there was an old man with a long white beard, and he was taking me across a golden bridge. And I started to hear these very odd sounds in my ears, and I thought, what is that? I never heard that sound before. Anyway, within a few minutes, she asked us all to come back into the room. And then she attempted to ask us what experiences we had. So I started to explain what had happened, and she said that she didn't know what I was talking about. So I was left very confused. Anyway, I left the church and still continued my pursuit of searching, reading books. And one of the books that really stood out for me was Siddhartha. It felt like whoever Siddhartha was had been on a spiritual quest, a journey, and had found what he was looking for. Then I carried on in my usual daily living, and I love to go out, I love dancing, and I found myself in a nightclub one evening, and I bumped into a guy called Jack Stander, who's in MSIA, who started talking about John Roger. And at the time I thought, wow, Jack really needs help. He sounds like he's troubled. So he invited me to a seminar, and I thought I'd go along and see what it was all about, see if I could help Jack in some way. So I found myself in St. John's Wood at the home of Nicholas Brown and Carol and Nathan. And it was very weird. The lighting was low. They were all sitting on the ground, on the floor with crossed legs. There was incense burning, there was candlelight, very hippie, but it was back in the 70s, so that was part of the culture. And they turned on this audio tape, and JR started to talk. And I was just completely blown away, because it was like everything that I wanted to hear or had imagined to be true, JR was saying. And when I left the seminar that night, I heard this voice in my right ear say, this is what you've been looking for, look no further. And I was just completely blown away. So I continued to attend seminars. Seminars for me was the seminars were everything for me because I could go there once a week. It would alleviate my karma. It would help me with the teachings, coupled with my spiritual exercises. It was, for me, very, very supportive. And to this day, I still attend seminars, whether it's Jesus Satsang or whether it's online seminars, whether it's John seminars. There's always that upliftment of energy. Anyway, after another, I think it was within 6 months, JR came into town. And I remember going to the airport to meet him. And I don't know really what I was expecting, but he came back to Nicholas's flat. And in those days, we used to sit around the kitchen table with JR, and he would just talk. I remember looking at him thinking, it's got a funny hairstyle, and because I'm a hairdresser, that's what I look at. And then he started talking about hair, and I thought, oh my God, I better be careful, this guy's reading my mind. Anyway, about a day later, he used to do these things called light studies, where he tells you what your karma is. And he tells you what you came into this lifetime to achieve. And he looked at me and he said, let's face it, he said, you're either an old soul or you've blown it a lot. So I said, I don't know what you mean. And he said, well, he said, usually between the years 230 to 240, you get off the wheel of reincarnation. So I had a joke and I said, well, I better be a good girl then. And we both started chuckling. And then I asked him what this vision was all about, because I thought if anyone could tell me, it was him. And he started to explain the vision that I had when I sat in the spiritual mediumship circle. He said that the work that I'd come to do personally was to be a bridge bearer. And it was to bring people across from the old consciousness into the new consciousness, the golden consciousness, the golden age consciousness. And he said, what I'd heard in my ear was the sound current. And he said that my work was to go out and sow the seeds of spirit. And he said that I wouldn't see the fruits of my work, but spiritually it would be the most rewarding. So I listened to it. I mean, it didn't make a lot of sense at the time. And then after the reading, we all got together again, and we always used to hang out with Nicholas, and Paul Kay was there at the time. And I can't remember when, but it was shortly after that, John Roger wanted us to have a MSI board outside of Los Angeles. It was the first board that they had. So Nicholas was the president, Paul was the vice president, and JR said, and you're going to be the secretary. And I said, why are you making me a secretary? I'm a hairdresser. He said, you'll learn. He said, MSI is all about learning. So I thought, okay, I'll take it on. So anyway, in the years that happened after that, Paul Kay and Nicholas both left to go to the States, and I was left behind holding the light, holding the fort down. And I began by having intros to MSIA seminars, weekly seminars, and this went on for about 28 years. I was a seminar leader. I was the MSI rep for 28 years. And one of the memories that came to me before I did this interview was the fact that Insight then was born in the UK. Ariana Stassinopoulos lived here in London, and she decided that she was going to assist Insight to grow. So we had the first intro to Insight, and it was so huge. It was 500 people who attended that intro. And most people came because they either wanted to see Ariana or her boyfriend at the time, Bernard Levin, who was a very well-known journalist. Anyway, after that, Russell Bishop came into town. That was 1978. And we had the first Insight. Then there was Insight 2, and I flew out to LA and I did the Insight 2 in Los Angeles. But I recall many seminars with JR as he was inside the training room with all the staff. And I remember this one seminar where all of us were literally passing out. The spirit was like whacking us. And we all passed out. We were all laying out on the floor. And then we kind of came to, and it was like we were in a different consciousness. It was remarkable. And that was one of the memories I had the other day. Anyway, life went on. Insight grew, MSIA grew, and we had about 60 to 100 people here on discourses. And over the years, that never really changed. It was always that amount, and it probably still is to this day. But every year, John Roger would come to London. He would visit, and to me, that was my highlight. That's what I looked forward to. That's what I enjoyed the most. That's what kept me going all year, knowing that he was coming, and I would arrange seminars or workshops. And there was one time when we went to Wales for a retreat, and I was seated opposite him on the train going up to Wales. And I asked him a question about somebody that I was having difficulty with. And he sort of, I tried to observe him. He went somewhere in his consciousness, and he came back and he gave me the information. And I said, "What did you do just now? I saw you go somewhere in your consciousness." And he said, "I went to the person you're asking me the question about, and I asked them how they wanted to be treated." So I used that technique. It was a great key for me in how to deal with difficult people. The other thing that I asked him another question, and he said, "I've got to ask my boss." I said, "What do you mean you've got to ask your boss? You're the boss." He said, "No, my big boss, Jesus Christ." And that was, another one of those moments. It felt like, wow. Anyway, throughout the years, JR would usually, when he came to London, and I would see him in those first few minutes, and he would always come towards me and give me one of JR's special hugs. And anything that I was dealing with kind of dropped away. All the karma dropped away. And I remember once I was really loaded down, and in 3 seconds, the whole thing just lifted off and I was clear. I did have opposition in the community with MSIA. I had people who were, I don't know, competitive or jealous, the fact that I'd spent time with JR, so I had to deal with that as well as organizing everything, and that was difficult for me at the time. But it was always a clearing and a learning, and ultimately it all worked out for the best. And just JR's practical wisdom for me was a lifesaver. I'd write to him and he'd just write a few words and the whole thing would lift off. One of the things that I was sharing with Jesu was the fact that before he died and he was getting older and his health was failing, he came to London, and I really thought it was going to be the last time I saw him. And he was about to leave the hotel in Knightsbridge where he stayed. And there were about 4 of us standing around his wheelchair. And we were sending the light to him and calling in the light. And I was touching his hands and saying how much I loved him. And I started crying because I didn't really know whether it was going to be the last time I would see him. And I heard this voice inside of me say, "Don't cry for me, Argentina." And it was hysterical. And when he went back, I wrote to Betsy and she said, "Can I tell JR about it?" And I said, "Yes, of course." So that was one of the, the jokes, and his sense of humor. Before I started this interview, Jesu played me this clip and it was so hysterical. And to me, that is one of the blessings that we have. We laugh and we get through it all. So he was practical, he had a great sense of humor, he was hugely expansive in his spirit. And I've never met anyone else on the planet that lifted the karma off like that, or had the wisdom, or had the expansion. And I relate that to having the preceptor consciousness as well as the mystical traveler consciousness. And to me, it's just, it goes beyond the knowledge, beyond the wisdom, into something way above what I consciously can understand. I'm just thinking if there's anything else. Oh yeah, one of the
Bovi, when we used to do the trips, talk about what was that castle where everybody took off?
Yeah, for another expansion in my ministry was working with Jesu and Zoe on bringing the film to England, Jesu's film, The Mystical Traveler. And I'm going to talk about that first and then go into the fact that we always used to have visits combined with screenings, and then we went to...
Well, first it was Spiritual Warriors you worked on, and then later.
Yeah. So Jesu asked me to work with Zoe to represent and bring the film to London for him. And part of that work was giving out flyers. And he insisted that he had 24,000 flyers. And being the warrior that I was, I went out and gave 24,000 flyers out. And we hired one of the most exclusive cinemas in London called the Curzon, which is very well known. It's in the West, in Mayfair. And we had 240 people attend the first screening of, was it Spiritual Warriors? Yeah. And that was a huge success. And God knows how many of those, I think all of the people that came were initiated that night on the other side, because anyone that sees JL's face is automatically initiated. And I can't remember how many times you came back for the different films that you did. Was it 4 or 5 times?
Well, we came every year. We came every year, did fundraisers, showed the movie, did book signings since 2007, really.
Yeah, and combined with that, JR would have a trip. So one of the first trips we went on was Morocco. And there was a group of us that went. And then I think, or was it Israel first? Israel was first, wasn't it?
It was everything started in Israel 2007, but the big trip that we did was 2009 in Israel, and 2010 Morocco, Italy.
Yeah. So every trip that they had that was going with JR, I was on it. I wouldn't miss it for the world. And luckily I had a benefactor that gifted me. So it was very easy and grace-filled. And the trips were just, they were just remarkable because JR was there, he was with us, he was on the coach with us, he was in the cities with us. In Morocco, I remember we all got sick with food poisoning, but that's another story. But usually something remarkable happened as a result of us going into these places. Like in Morocco, there was this huge event happened with Michael Hayes where he was almost pushed to the floor by this entity that came out of the ground. And I think JL said it was something to do with the opening up of the Arab Spring after that. Jesu, maybe you can help me with that.
The Arab Spring happened after JR and Michael cleared some big dragon that was suppressing Africa, the continent.
Yeah,
and it would help
right,
the Arabs and all that. And of course, it started in Tunisia, went into Egypt, and it was crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, and I remember this, we went on this 7-hour trip on a coach. And we went on this 7-hour trip, and halfway there, Michael had this experience. We get to this restaurant after 7 hours. I think we had a very light lunch, and we were back on the coach again for another 7 hours. But all this time, a lot of us were taken out, and we were doing SEs. So this is when this whole thing was going on. And every trip we went on, some major effect happened in the world after we'd been there. There was Israel. Israel was twice, wasn't there? There were 2 trips to Israel. And there was Scotland. I remember being in Scotland with JR.
Ireland.
Ireland.
Bovey like 3 times.
Bovey Castle was in Cornwall, and we went there 3 times. And we always had a fundraiser that would help to, pay for the film, pay for all the expenses and everything else that was going on.
That's great.
And yeah, the Q&A and the fundraisers were just amazing. There was JR on the stage with John, Michael Hayes, Paul Kay sometimes was on there. I think Jesu was on there. Who else was on the stage? Jesu.
I don't know.
Delisle, JR's brother, was always on the stage telling stories about JR's childhood. And I remember going to Israel for it was the second trip in a few years with JR, and it was like coming home. And there was Delisle talking about JR and his childhood with him, and it was very, very emotional for me. I don't know why, but I love those guys.
Well, I want to segue to, and I'll set it up. I knew that JR and I like castles. We like Camelot. And JR took me to London for the first time. And that's where I had, years ago, that's where I had tea and scones introduction. But before that, I had a tea and scone introduction with, let me see, I had an introduction with a Shakespeare teacher friend of mine called John Abbott, and I would make tea and scones and jam and all sorts of stuff when I was 16 years old. Cut to JR takes me there, and JR's like, yeah, this is clotted cream and scones and jam, and I think you would take us, Natalie, right, to all these places. Anyway, one day I was like, you know what? It started out in one castle, and from then on in, my goal was to hit every castle in the UK, and there's just too many of them, but I would have. And the idea was to fill initiates and ministers in every castle, doing tea and scones and clotted cream. It's JR's favorite. He just like clotted cream, period, on anything. And then the jam, the tea, and then we'd rotate. Instead of moving JR to every table, we'd rotate the tables. That was a spirit hit. We would do it in France. Anyway, in this one occasion, it was at, what was that castle where, what's the name of it?
Clevedon.
Clevedon,
But Clevedon wasn't a castle, it was just like a hotel manor house.
Whatever. It was a castle. Yeah. Go ahead.
No, it was a hotel. Anyway, the hotel Clevedon was in Berkshire, very posh. And you drive up, it's got this huge driveway, and there's Rolls Royces all the way down the driveway that leads up to the doorway. And it was like heaven on earth. There was something about the energy of this place that was just remarkable. And I remember having tea, and then the veranda doors were open, and you walk out and you see these grounds that just stretch forever. And I just felt like it was the first day of a new life for me. There was an energy that was coming in that was just beyond anything I'd ever experienced. And I noticed that slowly all our group were either sitting down because I couldn't stand it anymore because the energy was coming in so fast, so furious. Laurie Lerner was sitting on the floor in the lobby of the hotel, and the proprietors were going crazy because they thought, what is she doing on the floor here? But everyone was just kind of passing out. The spirit was just hitting all of us. and all of us went out for about 40 minutes.
Except me. I walked in. I remember I was shooting video outside. And I walked in. Everybody was out in the lobby. Probably 70 people sprawled all over the. And I think the guy was like, "What's going on here?"
And there was nothing he could do about it because he couldn't move us. We were like glued. Anyway, when we went back onto the coach, Michael Hayes started his wonderful explanation of what it was all about. And he said that many years, or I don't know which year it was, lifetimes, that Christ had been in that area and had instituted light. And we were there to reinstitute, bring in the light. And for me, it was like that whole energy field was kind of placed there. And then out of that, everything started to unfold in England. You know, then there's been Brexit and now the epidemic, and there was all these things coming up to clear. So, and JR did like coming to London. He told me himself he loved coming here.
Yeah, and I think part of we did this recording before you and I, and we had bad internet, but one of the things that I remember, like Nathalie was saying, JR, before or after travelers would arrive, there'd be some kind of event, or before they arrive and after they leave. And I just I just know my experience of working with JR and John. I think all the years that we just kept coming to London, it seemed like a base to unfold something. And here we are. Jumpstart, JR passed away 2014. It's 2020. We got Corona. We got Black people dying. We got every kind of people dying. We have Brexit. We have, it's very interesting what was left for us to do as initiates and ministers and hold the light and contain and conduct divine energy. Take it away, Nathalie.
Yeah, and yeah, one of the experiences that I would like to share was that I had this fear that after JR passed, because whenever I would write to him about anything, you know, it was just lifted within a day or maybe hours. And I had this fear that that wasn't going to continue. And the day after he passed, it was almost like he was sitting inside my chest. That's how present he was. And I was very grateful because I didn't grieve. There was nothing to miss. He was present in a bigger way than ever before. And again, when I ask, it's done. You know, it's that fast, it's that instant. But I have to say that I've always been very vigilant with my essays. I think for me, if there was anything I could encourage anyone to do, it's the spiritual exercises. Because that's the baseline with the reading of discourses and to attune yourself to the higher consciousness. Personally, I think it's sustained me throughout all these years with everything I've had to go through and face.
Is there anything other that you want to mention that's more metaphysical? Just let's go higher and deeper and in there than.
Whew,
what's a deep thing without?
Okay, it's a deep thing, but it's also simple. Because to me, spirit is very simple, very practical. I was flying on a plane going to New York to actually be with JR at a retreat or a seminar or something. And I was literally on the plane and I closed my eyes and I had this thing happen. And it was an initiation. And it was very fast, very simple. And afterwards I thought, wow, was that it? You know, it was so quick and so immediate. And to me, that's what spirit's all about. It's immediate. You know, the vision, the whatever came in. And that's how most of my initiations have been, very like in the dream state. I see something, I feel something, I feel a shift, and that is profound, but it's very immediate and very simple. I could tell you about my seeding experience with JR. Would you like to hear? Yeah.
Yes, go for it.
Yeah. So JR was in London again. He came every year, and it was Super 2. I think it was the only Super 2 he did in London. And JR was in the training room all the time, so he happened to come to lunch with us. He took all the assistants to lunch. It was in the training room. And people were hustling to get close to him, to sit next to him, to get by him, to look at him. And I was lining up, and I thought, I'm not going to hustle. I'm just going to put myself in line, and whatever takes place is for the highest good. And of course, I ended up sitting absolutely opposite JR. And he started talking to me about seeding and tithing. Well, it felt like he was talking directly to me because he just kept staring at me. And I thought, wow. And at the time, I was not tithing. And I went home that night and I decided to take a leap of faith. And I seeded £500 for financial abundance. And within a year, the abundance started pouring in. That's putting it lightly. I was given a luxury flat in London. I was given an allowance. Over the years, I was given a couple of cars. It was like anything that I needed was kind of handed to me like on a plate. That is part of my ministerial blessing, but it was still astounding the way it happened. And I really cannot remember a time when I seeded and I didn't get what I seeded for. It's like 99.9% of the time that I've seeded, I got what I seeded for. But sometimes it would come in a way that I hadn't expected it, through a different route, in a different form, but it was what I ultimately had asked for. The financial abundance came in with the home, because I'm still here, I'm still in my home, and it's the blessings continue from that abundance. I don't have to worry about, a mortgage and things like that. And I've had that for the last 20 years. So I'm very grateful for that seeding experience with JR.
Yeah, I've traveled the world, met many ministers and initiates, and I can tell based on my independent survey that it's like JR is taking care of everybody in their own way. There's to the level of their level and their comfort level, it's being taken care of. It's amazing.
Yeah, I just remembered another experience that I had with JR in my light reading. I asked him who he was in the lifetime of the Christ, because I was very new to MSI. So to ask him that question was like new for me. So he told me that he was John the Beloved in that lifetime. And he then explained how the whole thing worked. He said that Jesus worked with the 12 disciples, who then worked with the who then worked with the silent 70, who then worked with the 240. So those were the three groups. And he told me that I was in a scene and I was a record keeper and I was in a male form, and I would stay behind in the temple and keep the records. So that was one of the,
Say the first part. Say the first part again.
I asked JR what he'd been in the lifetime of the Christ, and he said it was John the Beloved. And then he said, Jesus worked with the 12 disciples, and then worked with the silent 70, and then worked with the 240. And he said, I was one of the 240. I was
and now we're 5,000.
And now we're 5,000. And we've all had our spiritual experiences.
Let's go. John the Beloved continues with the Christ. We're doing it, right?
We're doing it more than ever now. We're
Well,
taking on the role.
I look forward to coming there. It is June 23rd. I will be in Europe July 16th. So I'm coming. I'm coming and asking, not that the Christ and JR is not already there, but I want to keep bringing in the light and get there and do the work, and hopefully I can cross the pond and see you.
Yeah, I just want to thank you because during the pandemic, for me, my lifeline was your satsangs. It's like I get up about 6, turn on the computer, and there you were with JR. And the information and the energy kind of carried me through it all.
Yeah, I
So,
love doing, I've changed the name, so it's called JR Marathon in Satsang. So I really enjoy and I really love that word because I've heard JR use it many times, and it's in truth. So we sit and we come together in truth. And it's been fun to see you guys as I end, you and Sam and the rest, Leora, everyone's waking up over there in the UK. So it's really fun.
you're always JR's boy.
And,
JR's boy.
You've ministered to me a lot. After JR passed away, I was in the physical. I was going to London every year, and I still do. And I just love my little hanging out with you, and then walking around Hyde Park. It was very healing, that park, I tell you. Not to mention.
Well, I feel that when I'm with you, when you're in London, when you're in my home, I feel like JR's here.
Yeah, and well, there's a little secret thing that I'll tell people is that I have my birthday in London, been having it in London or on a plane on the way back back home. So, well, I remember I spent my 50th, 35,000 feet in the air, flying back to LA my 50th birthday. So anyway, thank you so much. Natalie, is there anything that you want to tell JR, or this is what I always say at the end?
I love you with all my heart, with all my soul, with all my being, and thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, Jesu.
Thank you, Nathalie.
More tea, Vicar. Keep calm and carry on.